الصلاة والسلام عليك
اللهم صل أفضل صلاة على أسعد مخلوقاتك سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم عدد معلوماتك ومداد كلماتك كلما ذكرك وذكره الذاكرون وغفل عن ذكرك وذكرهم.
My guest to discuss his beliefs today embarked on his journey to find God in his teenage years. Troubled by the mainstream Christian belief in a God that is three in one, the Trinity, Tim Winter tried the Unitarian Church. But it was his interest in Islamic art and his study of Arabic which eventually led him to convert, at the age of 19, to Islam. Now a Muslim scholar, Tim Winter lectures in Islamic studies in the School of Divinity and is chaplain at Cambridge University. He has edited the Cambridge Companion to Classical Islamic Theology and recently written Bombing Without Moonlight, The Origins of Suicidal Terrorism, under his Muslim name, Sheikh Abdul'Hakim Murad. More recently, he's been instrumental in setting up a global Catholic Muslim forum to improve relations between Islam and Christianity, and was one of a handful of keynote speakers at a conference in the Vatican in the autumn of 2008. He was recently awarded the King Abdullah Prize for Islamic Thought. Abdul'Hakim, explain to me the prize. That sounds rather impressive.
Well, yes, it came as something of a surprise, I must admit. It comes from Jordan, and every year they dish out this prize to a Muslim thinker or scholar who's dealt with a contemporary kind of controversial issue. And because a lot of my work recently has been on the question of suicide bombing and whether it can possibly fit into classical Islamic legal assumptions, they decided that they liked the book and some other work that I've done. So this thing, with a quite comfortably large cheque, landed on my desk.
And does it fit into Islamic theology?
Well, the conclusion of the book is that it has no place whatsoever. There's no mention of it in any classical work. It's something that presumably was picked up from people like the Tamil Tigers and maybe the kamikaze bombers of Japan during the Second World War, and comes into the Middle East about 20 years ago with people like Hezbollah, but it has no deep roots in the tradition.
And this book, which I have here, this book sets out that particular truth, that absolute truth.
That's right. It's an examination of the pedigree of this practice, seeking to pull the rug from beneath the fundamentalists who claim to be the champions of Islamic propriety, but pointing out that this thing is in fact entirely borrowed from other civilizations and not even monotheistic civilizations. So it's a work of polemic, but there's quite a lot of footnotes in there as well.
Well, late congratulations on the prize. Now, this business of Tim Winter becoming Abdul'Hakim Murad, two identities, who calls you which? Does your mother still call you Tim?
Well, my children call me still other things. One, I think nowadays, often has complex identity. I don't experience any kind of tension between Tim Winter and Abdul'Hakim Murad in my daily life. Parents, family, colleagues will use the English name. It's on my passport. There's actually no requirement in the religion to change one's name formally, but it's conventional for converts to take on an Islamic name. One is more easily understood in Muslim communities if one does that. So when I do things like Thought for the Day, for instance, on the Today programme, it's the Arabic name that I'll use. Let's
roll the years back and find out about you and your family, because you come from a family of Norfolk congregational ministers, very severe and requiring obedience, conformity perhaps. That was your grandfather's generation. Your father's an architect, and you grew up in Highgate and went to Westminster School, altogether more mainstream Anglican. So were you steeped in thinking religious thoughts?
Well, I suppose that in my childhood and early teens there was a backdrop to my own thinking, such as it was, that really reflected the crisis of faith and identity in modern Britain. Beginning of the 60s, most people went to church, and then you had amazing things happening like the Beatles and the Chatterley trial and women's lib and people experimenting with alternative spiritualities. So by the time I was in my teenage years, I guess the idea of Anglicanism or Christianity being the kind of default natural religion for English people had largely been abandoned, and I was part of a generation where people did experiment quite a bit. Although I'd never seen myself as a passionately religious person, I was a kind of default believer. I could see that believing in God offered the best available explanation for the mystery and beauty of the world.
And school, now Westminster School, of course, is the school of Westminster Abbey, so services every day and observation on all the festivals, so that must have been a regular part of your education.
Well, Westminster was really an extraordinarily exhilarating place to be, partly because we were forced to look in the eye the great paradox of the modern West, which is, on the one hand, every morning the school day began with these amazingly beautiful Anglican sounds and sights in Westminster Abbey, which were breathtaking even to kind of absent-minded teenagers who were concerned about which girl they were sitting next to more than what the dean was actually saying, but still, it had an impact on us. On the other hand, the actual intellectual, spiritual metabolism of the school is very much up-to-date, secular, questing, philosophical, positivistic. And so we had to try and pull those two things together. And there were one or two teachers there who were very concerned that we wouldn't just let this paradox ride, but that we actually confronted it and wrestled with it.
Nonetheless, you as an individual moving towards Islam, how did you come to learn about Islam then, within this nest of Christian faith?
Well, at school I had no knowledge of other religions, no interest in them whatsoever. The 70s was still quite an insular time. This is pre-multicultural Britain by some way. I'd never travelled particularly outside Europe, in fact, not at all. My initial steps on the road that led me in an Islamic direction came about rather improbably through sort of liberal reformist Anglicans, and in 1977 the controversy over somebody called John Hick, who published a book, The Myth of God Incarnate, in which he said, really it's time that we wake up to the fact that these ancient creedal metaphors, the triune God, the incarnation, the blood atonement, all of those things, as significant sort of serious biblical philosophical thinkers nowadays, we can't quite subscribe to them any longer. And it was things like that that actually
did you
held
go along
our
with
attention. Well, it was certainly an issue for those sort of oddities in the school who were sort of actively interested in religion as something that was positive, something we were committed to. And it sort of pushed me in the direction of knowing that I really wanted to believe in God. That was the only explanation that could possibly suit my mind for the mystery of being, existence, morality, and all the rest. But I could never, with fullness of heart, accept the classic doctrines of the Christianity with which I'd been raised. So now, I started to look for alternatives.
It was the Trinity that got to you. You couldn't deal with the concept of the Trinity. But I wonder how many Orthodox Church of England churchgoers worry about the Trinity. I mean, clearly you were bringing an intellectual perception to these concepts, which was going to make life very, very difficult and perhaps open up your career. I mean, you were very thoughtful about such a matter, and you even went to the Unitarians, who obviously don't believe in the Trinity, and tried them out.
Yes, it was a kind of self-righteous determination to be true to myself. I didn't really want to recite the creed in an Anglican church or a United Reformed church without really thinking that it was right, because it is part of the liturgy in most Christian churches. So I really wanted to get to the bottom of that.
So you're drawn towards Islam. So the Quran, when did you first open it? What did you make of it?
It was a complicated road. I had no interest in those others of my contemporaries who were interested in following the Maharishi or going to ashrams and doing that kind of thing. I was really interested in religion in a rather dry, cerebral, bookish kind of way. I wanted to get to the bottom of this question of the nature of God. I wanted also to know exactly who the historical Jesus of Nazareth, one of the most luminous and compelling people in world history, actually took himself to be. How did he worship? Did he consider himself to be Jewish, to be bound by the Jewish law? Did he believe in the Trinity? I had to get to the bottom of that, and as a kind of passionate 16, 17-year-old, sitting up late at night with black coffee, agonising over these things with friends.
Yes, I know.
It was at the centre of our lives.
I know, but Abdul'Hakim, you haven't yet talked about what Islam has to offer you about the nature of God. So tell me about how that arrived.
Right. Well, I ended up as a Unitarian. When I went up to Cambridge as a spotty undergraduate, I attended the small Unitarian chapel there, which was a great experience. But simultaneously with all of this, I'd been attending evening classes at a small college in London in Arabic, the intention being not to learn about God, but to do economics at Cambridge with Arabic so that I could go and make a killing in the Gulf. That was my aspiration. It really was.
That's pretty worldly ambition.
Yes, so it started off with precisely the wrong intention. And then at some point it dawned on me that actually the theology of Islam, which I was kind of starting to learn about as part of the Arabic course that I was doing, ticked all of the boxes that my inherited Christianity had left vacant, which was quite a shocking realization for me, because by temperament I didn't really want to take a major step, do anything exotic. I saw myself as very English.
Okay, well, it answers because it's not Trinity. What other of the boxes that Christianity failed to tick did Islam tick?
I always wanted to have the person of Jesus, who I was brought up with and who is this extraordinary world figure, as part of my religious vision of the world. Islam is the only non-Christian religion where he's really important, but actually comes closer to you in a strange kind of way, because in the Orthodox Christian understanding, he is man, but also God. And I couldn't figure out how you can actually be human if you're also God. So in a strange kind of way, I felt that one of the consequences of becoming Muslim was to become much closer, empathetically, humanly, to the person of Jesus than I'd ever managed as an Anglican.
So, and how did you then come close to Muhammad?
The first book that I picked up about the Holy Prophet of Islam was by a French atheist Marxist, Maxime Rodinson. Not very promising, but that was all Penguin Books offered at the time. And what I saw, as it were, between the lines of Rodinson's rather kind of tongue-in-cheek, shrugging Gallic put-down, was somebody who had lived absolutely passionately for God, for the one God, not for the Trinitarian God of the churches, somebody who did not just sit back, turning the other cheek, while his people were abused, but actually stood up as a kind of revolutionary in order to overthrow the tyrannous power structures and the unjust economic system of the time, and actually to unite his people. So somebody,
so you've got a social reformer.
A kind of Che Guevara figure, but with God. And I found that extraordinarily compelling.
And how were you introduced into this faith? I mean, conversion, what does that mean? Is it you sitting in your room, acknowledging in your inner heart that you've become a Muslim, or is there some formality about it?
People convert online, they convert through text messages nowadays. You'd be horrified at what goes on. The traditional way, what you do is you sit with a couple of witnesses in front of somebody who repeats to you the basic testimony of faith. I believe in one God, and Muhammad is the final messenger of God. And that's it. Once you've said that, you're as much of a Muslim as anybody else. Whether you pray or not, whether you fast or not, you're a fully paid up member. And I remember the night before my conversion, the last thing I thought about, I guess, before going to sleep was, I'll never be able to lie in again because I have to get up at dawn to pray every day for the rest of my life. And this was kind of... well, but when I realised what it was like and how beautiful the dawn is and how great it is to get up early and to pray and to recite those ancient words, it's the best time of day for me. But before I tasted it, as it were, it did look a little bit intimidating.
And the Quran, did you have to learn, as we see so many people doing when they're in the madrasas, learning the Quran, reciting it? Did you have to go through that?
I've memorised certain portions of the Quran because that's really the heart of the way we worship. It's a bit like the Eucharist, I guess, in Christianity. The Word is made flesh, and so the Eucharist is how you partake of that. And in Islam, the Word is, if you like, rather crude metaphor, but perhaps there's a parallel, made book. And therefore when we recite the Quran, we, as it were, breathe the words of God, and that's our experience of the sacred, or the core experience of the sacred. So pronunciation of the original Arabic text is really important.
And that has a sort of Eucharistic value for you, does it, as you are doing it? You feel that you are as close to God as you can come.
That's right, because our belief about the Quran is that it is the uncreated word of God. It existed before Adam and Eve and the Big Bang and everything else. It is of God in some mysterious way. So as we breathe it, we sing it, we cantillate it, we internalise it, learn it by heart, it has a transformative effect. It is a bit Eucharistic.
Now, something else that is transformative, or has been for you, is music. Mm-hmm. You incline towards Sufism within the range of Islamic interpretations, and the music has been very important. So if we listen to some of it, I'd like you to tell me what it means to you.
That's the Turkish reed flute, the ney, played by one of my all-time heroes, Kudsi Erguner. The reed flute is one of the key characters of the greatest of all Muslim poems and Sufi texts, which is by Rumi. And the whole poem, which is about 30,000 verses long, begins with listen to the reed flute, how it makes lament, and how it recalls nostalgically how it was torn from the reed bed. And the Sufi metaphor is the believer, the one who is submitted to God, is in the hands of God like the reed flute in the hands of the skilled musician. So you resonate with the voice of God, with the word of God. You're completely passive in the hands of the benign artist. And the tune that comes out is reminding us of the reed bed, where we were from. So when you listen to Sufi music or any other form of Islamic liturgical music, basically it's about that. It's about remembering where we were and what we were before the world. So it's a kind of cosmic nostalgia.
You spent 6 years in the Middle East, so having become a Muslim in your East Anglian stronghold, you travelled to Turkey, you went to the Balkans, I think you were in Egypt at some one time. So you were looking at not just Sufism, which in the West is regarded as the most congenial, perhaps, form of Islam in many circles. You began to see other kinds of Islam. You began to be familiar with Wahhabism, were you?
Yeah, I mean, my conversion had been really a very private, rather strange thing. I didn't actually meet any practicing Muslims until I went along for the conversion ceremony. So then it was obvious at some point I'd have to see the reality. And the first thing I did was to go to Morocco. And my first experience in Morocco was I was with a school friend, and we looked at the map and found a small place where we decided we'd spend the night. The bus put us off. There was no place there except for a tea house and a whole load of pine trees, and it was midnight. And these Moroccans drove up in a pickup truck and pushed us on the back of the pickup truck without a word, took us off into the mountains. Later I realised they thought we were the usual ragamuffin Westerners looking for hashish, so they could cut a good deal with us. So the next morning I woke up, this beautiful valley, and there was only one crop being cultivated, and the light of the sun, and it was wonderful. That was kind of shocking to my sort of neophyte, puritanical, idealistic idea about the Islamic world. The most shocking thing was, in the middle of this valley, obviously with the proceeds, they built themselves a beautiful little mosque. So that was quite a good lesson for me, really, even though I was shocked at the time, because it taught me that I was going to have to deal with the reality, which is that theory and practice in Muslim communities have a complicated relationship with each other.
Now, you're growing up and into a new culture. What do you make of the attitude to women within the Islam that you embraced?
I'd experienced British public schools when there were no women, and we had heard vague rumours of their existence. And then, while I was at school, they appeared in all of their sort of peacock finery, and we were duly amazed, and the culture changed overnight. But I was always quite comfortable with a world in which there was immense mutual respect, but where there was a certain separation as well. One of the great things for me worshipping in mosques was that distraction, charming though it was actually no longer there, because the women are way out of sight in another part of the building. That was my main experience of gender issues in Islam as I joined up.
But also the evaluation of women within judgmental legal system and so on is to make a woman a less valuable person than a man in courts of law and things like that.
That's not the way most Muslim women will put it. The reality is that at the moment in England, probably a majority of converts are actually women. Women do seem to really enjoy the religion and flourish within it.
Nonetheless, it's at the crux very often of the disagreement between the West, if we're going to speak in those terms, the West and the East, that the democratic countries will say Islam does not give the equal weight to women. Indeed, they don't wish to acknowledge their equal value, and that is very often at the basis of many political disagreements between the outside world and Islam.
Well, certainly the politicised fundamentalist movements in the Islamic world overwhelmingly want to push women out of sight, and you don't see many women leading those movements. But it's also the case that most Muslims aren't actually at ease with those movements, and I've never been attracted to the fundamentalist wing of Islam, even though it's there and it's active and well populated. But for instance, just 2 weeks ago I was at the Vatican. We had this audience with Pope Benedict. The Catholic delegation, made up of clergy, by definition was all men, but there were several women in the Muslim delegation, including Ingrid Mattson, who's the head of the Islamic Society of North America. So it's not just the Islamic religion that has had difficulties in pushing women up to a position.
Perhaps it's all religions, I think to myself.
Well, that's probably the case. All traditional religions do assume that the place of women is in the domestic sphere, and that's something that, in my view, and on these social issues, I tend to take a rather soft rather than a fundamentalist view. I think that if women now have different aspirations, the religion really has to try and re-examine its inner mechanisms and find ways in which they can flourish.
Abdul'Hakim, what effect did September the 11th have on you?
Well, it was disgusting, of course, as it was for everybody. I couldn't sleep for a long time. The realisation that a lot of other very bad things were likely to happen quite soon alarmed one, and also the sense of sort of pollution and dishonour that this thing had been done not just for some silly political ideology, but in the name of one's own religion was kind of sickening. So that was atrocious. And then, of course, we had to orient ourselves and actually explain to the uncomprehending public opinion in the West that Islam is not a single thing, and that point of view is a lunatic fringe, and we have nothing to do with it.
Did you feel any guilt at all?
I don't believe in that kind of guilt, but I do think that the Muslim leadership, and insofar as I engage with them myself, have the principal responsibility to engage with those people theologically and explain to them why they're wrong. We can't really allow the Pentagon to sort out an internal Muslim theological issue, because that's not going to work. And insofar as one is guilty, one feels that we haven't quite won that argument yet.
You haven't done that strongly enough, perhaps?
No, and part of the problem is that it's really political grievances that are behind it. They're saying, why should we respect the West at all if all they do is bomb us and take our oil and insult us, and why shouldn't we have a go at them?
There are also there are many political issues around this which are closely knit with Islamic faith. For example, many Muslims tell me that they don't acknowledge the Declaration of Human Rights, and that democracy is not their choice, and would, as it were, those who champion democracy please back off, because they want to choose their own form of political organisation. Now, do you share that attitude to democracy?
Where democracy is brandished triumphantly by the West as the only possible political future for everybody, not just by Westerners, whether or not Afghan villagers want it, I think that that's counterproductive and outrageous. However, in the course of my travels, I find that the overwhelming majority of practicing Muslims in the West say that their countries are not democratic, not because of Islam, but because the West doesn't want them to democratize in case unsympathetic leaders come to the fore.
I can believe that, but do you yourself want to see democracy come to the fore, the best form of democracy?
Yeah, I take the view that the Muslim world is so internally diverse that a single template for the political life of all countries will not be forthcoming. There may be countries where the great majority of people actually don't want Western-style liberal democracy because they don't want the satellite dishes, the pornography, the lotto, whatever it is. I think that has to be respected. But overwhelmingly, I believe that representative government, representative democracy is not only what religious Muslims overwhelmingly want, but is the way out of the current dreadful situation where the West and the ruling elites are terrified of the public opinion. That can't go on forever. It's too horrible.
So where are we now? You have been part of these attempts to reconcile Islam and Christianity. The great demand by the Christian Church, as I understand it, is reciprocity, which is that they would like Christians to be treated with as much tolerance in Islamic countries as Muslims are treated here. Is that possible, likely?
Well, I hope that there would be more than reciprocity. Life for Muslims in Europe and America is a kind of hell at the moment. The way in which we're constantly insulted in the mass media, the way in which it's extraordinarily difficult to build mosques in just about any town in France that's controlled by the National Front, specific legislation against Muslim religion in Germany, prohibitions on conversion in many Orthodox countries, including Greece, the impossibility of getting permission to build mosques in most Orthodox countries. That's our reality. Europe is not some kind of enlightenment land of plenty and promise. If you're looking at it from underneath, from the perspective of asylum seekers, the weak, racially marginalised people, it's not actually terribly nice. Yes, I believe in religious freedom, and many Muslim countries have a long way to go, but I don't think that the West is necessarily the model people should be following. It's not a good situation here, and in many ways, with the rise of the far-right parties, it's becoming worse.
Nonetheless, if you live in Saudi Arabia, you can't celebrate Christmas. I mean, that feels pretty, restrictive.
I mean, in just about every other Muslim country you can, and the last time I was in Pakistan at Christmas, the municipality in Lahore had put up rather tired-looking Santas and Christmas trees all over the public thoroughfares. Saudi Arabia is a special case because of their theology, which is the Wahhabi theology, which is a particularly puritanical, uncompromising sort of Islam. But overwhelmingly in the Muslim world there are churches, and there are lots of new churches in the Gulf which I've visited, and the situation is not as bad as the media claim.
Well, we come back to Wahhabism, which is, although, as you say, a small and particular puritanical sect, and it has to be confronted as a really dangerous political movement. Where and how do you imagine that growing, developing, and being overwhelmed or muted into some tolerating faith?
Wahhabism, like any fundamentalism, I suppose, has its internal arguments. There is a radical wing within Wahhabism that takes the sort of puritanical absolutism that's the basic principle of their theology into the realm of the legal and the political, and it is, in a perhaps slightly aberrant form, the basic dynamo that guides Al-Qaeda, for instance. But nonetheless, one of the targets of Al-Qaeda is, of course, the House of Saud in Saudi Arabia, which is also committed to Wahhabism. So sometimes we speak of Royal Saudi Wahhabism, which is generally politically quiet, and the Wahhabis of mass destruction.
And where do you stand? I mean, you lead prayers in the Cambridge Mosque, thoughtful people peacefully going around about their faith. Do you comment on these political issues in the broader world which are bringing such hostility towards Muslims?
People expect from a Friday sermon in the mosque that it won't be completely detached from the headlines or from their lives. It's also the case that there are certain rules for the preacher, and one of my teachers in the Middle East, an elderly Yemeni, said, when I said, what do I have to do because I really want to preach and stand up and have a big turban and sort of be admired, which was kind of what was in my heart, I must admit. He said, well, there's two basic rules. First, you have to love the congregation, otherwise you can't do it. Secondly, you mustn't focus on things that are the basis of a legitimate argument within the congregation. There are other contexts in Islam, and we're doing that all the time, but the Friday formal ceremony is a time for focusing on what actually holds people together, and I try as much as I can not to annoy people. Sometimes I fail.
Nonetheless, you feel, as you've expressed it, that the Islamic community is a subject of abuse and fear. What's your prediction for getting us all out of this mess?
What just about everybody wants is for the British Muslim community to be more integrated in a positive sense. The problem that one faces with a lot of young people is that they say, why should we integrate into a society that obviously hates us so much? They don't respect anything that is distinctive about Islam, so why should we? That's a good argument, and it's very hard.
Answer?
The answer is, never mind what they think about you, trust in God. Islam is a religion that wants its members to succeed, to be positive neighbours, to be part of the national endeavour. And whether or not people like you at the workplace, whether or not they bully you in the police or the armed forces, you just have to trust in God, and your faith in God, if it's real faith in God, should enable you to deal with any obstacles that might come your way.
Are you, as a convert, something of a bridge for them between these communities?
I'm not sure that I'm fully on the wavelength of many of the young people in our inner cities. Sometimes I go to Bradford, sometimes I go to Small Heath in Birmingham, Tower Hamlets, and talk to the young people. But I don't believe, if I'm honest, that I do it often enough really to be able to get under their skin and figure out exactly where the pain is.
Abdul'Hakim, what is under your skin now? Has the journey been complete, and has it been fulfilling?
What is under my skin is the sense that you've won the battle, now you have to fight it. I think what it means is that you go through the door, and then the reality of religion is before you, which is ultimately about loving and adoring God, loving and adoring his creation, which is endlessly brilliant, beautiful, rigorous, difficult, fascinating, and trying to represent in one's own life a conformity to how God wants his servants to be. And that's difficult. Learning how to pray is easy, but actually conforming in the depths of one's being to what the divine, benign nature wants us to be, that's the real challenge, and I'm still working on that.
Abdul'Hakim Murad, thank you very much.